After William Deighton was killed on Close Lane, the valley didn't fall silent. It changed its kind of noise. No more gunshot, no shouting in the dark, no body left in the mud. Something quieter began. Paper moved. Names were written down. Doors closed. And in Halifax, a solicitor called Robert Parker began a different kind of war. Not with pistols, not on the lane, but with statements, rewards, pardons, and men who suddenly had a reason to speak. In November 1769, William Deighton was dead. A government officer, shot near Halifax, beaten after he fell. And for the men who ordered it, or knew of it, there may have been a moment when it felt finished. It's a dangerous man removed, a warning sent, a valley protected. But murder changes the weight of a thing. Coining had been one kind of crime. Gold clipped quietly, edges shaved, coins passed from hand to hand. But killing an officer of the crown, that brought another force into the room. Not anger, attention. And attention can be more dangerous than anger. The Marquis of Rockingham called an inquiry, and men gathered at the Talbot Inn. Respectable men, magistrates, gentlemen, those whose names that opened doors. And among them was Robert Parker, a Halifax solicitor, a man of documents, a man who understood that power did not always ride down a lane. Sometimes it sat at a table, sometimes it dipped a pen, and sometimes it asked one frightened man to name another. Picture the room. Rain on the windows, wet coats steaming near the fire, boot mud drying on the boards, candles burned low, and papers spread out. Halifax outside. Stone, smoke, dark water, narrow streets. And somewhere beyond it all, Cragg Vale. The lanes, the farms, the cottages. It was the places where clipped gold had passed so often, it had almost become ordinary. That was the danger of it. It had become ordinary. And people knew, or half knew, or chose not to know. And in a place like that, silence was not empty. Silence was work. Parker's task was not simply to find the criminals. It was to break a system of knowing. The coiners were not strangers hiding in some far-off wood. They were woven into the valley. Farm labourers, tradesmen, families, neighbours, men seen at markets, men known in inns, men whose wives bought flour, men whose children passed into the road. And that's what made it strong. And that is what made it vulnerable. Because once fear changed direction, everyone knew where to look. After Close Lane, the valley had two fears. The old fear of the coiners, and the new fear of being named. That was Parker's war room. Not one room only, perhaps, but a way of working, a pressure, a net made of paper, statements taken, suspicions recorded, rewards offered, and pardons whispered about, and slowly the great secret of the valley began to lose its shape, because a secret shared by too many people is not a secret. It's a waiting collapse. Think of what that meant. Not in the abstract, but in life. A man sits by a fire and he hears boots outside. A woman lowers her voice when a neighbour steps in. And someone who once took clipped coin without question now wonders who's spoken. An inn grows quieter when a stranger enters, and a name said in one room, then written in another. And once written, it doesn't stay still. A sheet of paper can travel farther than a threat. It can outlive panic. It can be folded, copied, carried to York, and it can hang a man. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. And it's worth staying here for a moment, because it's easy, too easy, to tell this as justice arriving cleanly. A good officer murdered. A solicitor takes up the case. The guilty are found, and the law is satisfied. And yes, there is a truth in that. But the Calder Valley was not a stage play. It was a working place. Hard lives, hard weather, and hard choices made without good options. Coining didn't grow in empty air. It grew where money was short, where the gold passed through hands that rarely held much of it, and where law felt distant until it arrived at your door. And when it did arrive, it didn't always arrive evenly. Some men had lawyers. Some men had names that carried weight. Some men had neither. Parker didn't walk into a simple valley of villains. He walked into a valley of pressure. And then he applied another pressure. And that's what makes this story linger. Not that the law came, but how it came. Through fear, and through bargains, through men saving themselves by handing over others. Now we can't know from a distance of how much was said was true, how much was panic, how much was an old score settling, wearing the shape of justice. Parker had to work inside it all, not as a ghost hunter, not as a hero from a ballad, but as a solicitor. Careful, patient, and dangerous in a quieter way. There's a kind of courage in walking down a dark lane. Deighton had that. But there's another kind of courage, or calculation, in sitting behind a desk and deciding which name matters next. Parker wasn't covered in mud on Bullclose Lane. He was not the man who heard the pistol click. But after Deighton fell, Parker became part of the machinery that answered. And machinery does not need rage. It only needs motion. Once it begins, it keeps turning. Across Halifax, the story would have travelled in fragments. Not all at once. A man taken, another questioned, someone gone quiet, someone not seen at the market, someone's wife standing too long at the doorway, and someone's brother leaving before dawn. And over it all, that same uneasy knowledge. The valley has spoken too much. The room had heard enough. And this is the part of the coiner's story that almost feels like folklore, even when we keep to the history. Because every community has a room like this, a room where decisions are made elsewhere, a room where ordinary people never see, a room where your life becomes a line of ink. And once that line is written, the road beneath your feet changes. The same hills are there, the same river, the same smoke from the chimneys, but the place is altered. Because now, someone has your name. Robert Parker did not need to haunt Halifax. The papers did that. The ledgers, the lists, the examinations, the careful legal memory of what men had done and what other men said they'd done. That's the Calder haunting. Not a figure at the end of the bed, not a face at the window, but a record, a mark, a sentence beginning with your name and ending somewhere you cannot control. After Bullclose Lane, the coiner's will began to narrow. Roads that once carried clip coin carried rumour. Inns that once held confidence held caution. Neighbours watched neighbours. And somewhere in Halifax, Robert Parker kept working. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. Violence can flare and vanish, but a determined officer, with paper, witnesses, authority and time, can grind a hidden world down. So perhaps the story has two shadows. One on Bullclose Lane, where William Deighton fell, and one in a room in Halifax, where the answer began. One shadow made by a pistol, the other by candlelight. One by men trying to stop the law, and the other by a man learning how to make the law move. And between those shadows, the valley changed. The coiners had trusted silence, they trusted kinship, they trusted distance, and they trusted the shape of the hills. But after Deighton's murder, none of that held. Because one man walked into the valley and died there, and another man sat down with paper and made certain the valley could no longer keep still. Some men hunt with pistols, some with horses, some with dogs, and some with ink. After Bullclose Lane, Halifax learned to fear them all. And that's Giles signing off. And if you ever find yourself in a room with rain at the window and papers left open on a table, remember this, that some hauntings don't need a ghost. Some begin when somebody writes down your name.